Okay. So our job today is to give definition to what we mean by cultural psychology and looking at the difference between what we mean by cultural psychology versus cross-culture psychology. So to begin, we need to look at defining what culture is and what culture is not, okay? So for example, when we talk about your nationality, we're saying, United States citizen or even Arizona citizen or Tohono Nation or that national identity that is provided you by the place that you have citizenship to. And we have to think, and then there's another complicated part of that is differentiating between nationality, culture, and ethnicity. Okay. And are they the same as culture? And we'll kind of explore this in more depth as we move along to kind of distinguish the difference between someone's ethnic background and their cultural background. And we'll take a closer look at this. I'm leaving this as kind of a question mark right at the moment. But as we will see, there is actually a distinct difference between your ethnicity and your culture, even though there is some overlap. So who studies cross culture? Who studies culture? Well, we've been saying since the beginning of the class, cross culture psychology, cultural psychology, but there's also things like indigenous psychologies, which you'll be getting into in your self-study um, articles that I hope everyone is opening up and taking a look at. Anthropology, which is really the study of cultures. That's what anthro and pology mean. And then in a lot of universities, there's cultural studies such as women's studies, Black history studies, those kinds of things. And then, of course, our friends over in the sociology area also explore the influence of culture on group settings or group processes. So these are kind of the different areas in which culture is studied in the academic area. But let's look specifically kind of at some constructs that we need to think about when we're thinking about culture. So the first one is cultural universals, okay, or cultural specific. So when we're investigating some behavior or mental process, we want to know if that is universally recognized, if it's something that is presented in each culture, or is that phenomenon specific to a given culture? Okay. And probably a good kind of historical example of this is IQ scores. So when intelligence tests were developed, they were developed based on the Western concept of intelligence. So that's reading fluency, um, uh, logic fluency, and logic in this case being a deductive or reductive type of process. Things like mathematical abilities using Western techniques to solve um, different IQ questions. And then, of course, when especially in these early days here in the United States, we started comparing, of course, the average score, which was normed on white middle class to upper class children to adults. Okay, and then we went and started to administer these IQ tests to non-Western cultures, and we found that they had lower IQs, okay, based on the test. All right. And the criticism of that is it was imposing what intelligence should look like on another culture. And but instead they determined that there are just less intelligent cultures than the Western culture. Okay, because we found that blacks, in individuals in the South America countries, Asia and Africa tended to score much lower on these tests than what the tests were normed to. Okay. Well, we have to accept now that a lot of those tests are what we call cultural specific, meaning that they were based on Western thought and Western ideas of what intelligence is. And so the question becomes is now that we know it's not universal and we've accepted that, originally they used it to justify prejudices. But now that we know that those IQ tests don't really measure cross-culturally what it is, we consider those IQ tests cultural specific to those cultures that is the way intelligence is defined. Okay. Now we've talked a little bit about cultural universals. When we were talking about Sigmund Freud, I brought up Carl Jung, and he mentioned the collective unconscious. And if you remember, in that conversation about the collective unconscious, he mentioned that there's archetypes that exist across cultures. Okay, so every culture has a definition of mother. They have a concept of mother. They have a concept of father. They have a concept of heroes and villains. And if you remember, I bring up the example of we had 4 to 6 months old, and we showed them pictures of, for example, Charles Manson versus Martin Luther King. Even at 4 months of age, they would do approach behaviors to Martin Luther King and withdraw behaviors to Charles Manson. And this was shown not only in the United States, but in Asia, such as Japan. And I think one study came out of China, and it kind of indicates this idea that there are these universals that go across cultures. But as I mentioned, I believe in the first class, culture does have an influence on the arrangements of parents. Okay, so I mentioned here in the United States, we're a minority in the idea of monogamy, that about 90% of other countries do polygamy, or I can't remember, one of you put it in the chat before, but the female version of polygamy. And we mentioned the individuals in the Amazon where the fathers were the individuals who the mother reproduced with, because each father gives an essence to that child. So, again, if your mom wanted the smart baby, strong baby, she would go find the strongest man in the community and the smartest man in the community, and they were that gave the infant their essence. And then from there, both of those individuals would move forward and claim father paternity over the child. But if we go now to New Guinea, which is another place that hasn't been too influenced by Western culture, there is a tribal group in New Guinea where females are very sexually free. They can go and have explicit or sex with anyone they want to, and it's seen as a pleasure thing. And then when an infant is born, it is actually the brother and aunt who take on the mother-father role. And the family kind of starts taking on those family roles, and the men who impregnated the woman really had no paternity over the child. It was a family of the woman who takes over the care of the child. So even though we can say there's these cultural universals, a mother, father, villain, heroes, there's still cultural influence on how those are um, uh, addressed or displayed. Okay. So we have to look at those. What is universal? What is cultural specific? And we'll get into a lot of these in the class. There are some, out of psychophysics, telling the difference between two weights. At what point do you tell one is heavier than the other? There's some universals that just exist. There's very few that we know of, but there are. And then we'll talk about cultural specific approaches as well. And then we also, I've mentioned this before about emics versus etics, and I didn't use these terms, but when we're talking about emics, what we're interested is a single culture. So and this is kind of analogous to the term cultural psychology, is when we're just interested in understanding a single culture, we do everything we can to understand that culture without comparing it to other standard of a culture somewhere else. Okay. And then we have the topic of ethics. And this is where we look at cultures based on cross-cultural examples. We want to know the difference between, for example, Western culture, Eastern culture, and or Southern culture versus Northern culture. This is where we are comparing across cultures. And where this can get very complicated is, let's say we are studying Western culture, okay? And we're studying it here in the United States. Well, we also have to understand the idea of what's called regional cultures, okay? So, for example, individuals have a different cultural view here in the um, um, Southwest United States versus the Northwest United States on things like conservatism and liberalism, and the role of parents even slightly differ from place to place. And so we got to look at these complicated ideas even when we're just studying the emics of it. And a good example of this right now, which we'll get into, is Chinese culture. China tends to be put in one umbrella, but there's two distinct cultures in China. There's the ones, especially dealing with youth at the moment, that live in the city. They kind of have distanced themselves from the family, and they're trying to live more of what you would say, quote unquote, Western culture is. And then there's rural China, which is very collective, and I'll get to these terms here in just a minute. They're very collective, they're very family oriented. They don't have the individualism part of it. And indeed, in these when we look at rural China versus the more westernized city version, when we look at things like marriage, most of the time in Western culture, it's an advantage to have a boy. Okay, especially when we look at it from historical perspectives, because of course the boy will become the king, the boy will take over the family system in that patriarchal system. But in rural China, it's actually more beneficial to have a girl, because when a boy chooses a girl in rural China, they have to give a huge dowry to the family in order for the father of the daughter to give his daughter to them. And so, and yeah, it sounds like slavery in a sense, but it's part of their culture. It's something they all enter into. So in rural China, it's more beneficial to have a girl than a boy. But then when you get into the Western, more westernized city version, it's more beneficial to be a man than a woman. Because we see a lot of different abuses that happen to women in the more urban communities there in China. So this is an example where we can't always separate which culture we're studying in one view. Even within a country, we could be doing cross-cultural comparisons, even within that country. And then we have the idea of ethnocentrism versus cultural relativism. Okay. Um, and this is the idea, ethnocentrism is the idea that my culture is the way people should be. And so we can look at this in the time of colonialism and colonization, when Western powers came to the United States and they started to acculturate the native people here, putting them in boarding schools and all those kinds of things, because the Europeans had an ethnocentrism attitude that their culture is the best culture and this is how it could be. And we can see still some of those legacies of that colonialism still here in the United States, with a lot of people thinking that the United States is the greatest country in the world, the greatest place to be, even though statistically, when we compare ourselves to other modern countries, we don't fare out as well. And the first thing that pops to my mind is birth. We have a very, very poor survival rate of children being born here in the United States when we compare ourselves to the other more technology-based advanced countries. And we can also see this in education comparisons. The United States lags way behind other countries. So we still can see some of that ethnocentrism, even though when we look at it objectively, we're not always doing the best job here with our youth and with our families. Now, cultural relativism is this notion that culture is relative to the place that you're in. Think about it as who is that? Einstein's theory of relativity, that things are the way they are relative to the situation. So cultural relativism is just this idea that, for example, if I'll go back to colonialism, if when the Western powers came over and they were what you would call cultural relativists, they would have attempted to then integrate themselves into the culture because that was the relative culture at that time and in that moment. So, what instead of having colonialism, what you would have is the Western powers coming over and trying to integrate them into native life. Um, Instead of trying to force their ethnocentric ideas onto the native people here in the United States. And probably the last construct that we will be using a lot in this class is the notion of individualism and collectivism. Okay. And this was found to be a relatively stable thing. So we have something called reliability and validity. Validity, when we measure something, is it measuring what it says it's measuring? So we take a measure and we use some behavioral standards, some, in this case, way of living, to say that the test is measuring these two concepts. Reliability is at multiple times does the test continue to test reliably. So for example, if I gave you um, let's say an exam today, a pop quiz, okay? And so I give you that pop quiz, and let's say you score an 85, okay? And then just after that, I wait an hour or so and I give you that test again. And on the second run, let's say you score a 55, okay? What we would say is that test has very little reliability because it's not measuring knowledge consistently over time. So these two concepts, the reason why we use them a lot is because they've been found to be very reliable and very valid in their measurements. If we look at it from a very broad perspective, what we find is that Westernized cultures tend to measure higher on individualism, where more Eastern or what you would call indigenous societies measure more collective. So what's the difference now between individualism and collectivism? Individualism, in its most basic definition, is the idea that you yourself determine your success and failure, that it doesn't rely on anyone else. It's not your parents' fault that you didn't end up with the best job when you grow. It's on you. And it's this idea of, if you want to put this up, individualism is the people who say, pull your boots up and get busy. Or they have this idea that poverty is caused by someone who is lazy and doesn't want to work. Okay, that's an individualistic mindset. Collectivism is this idea, if we want to put it in most simple terms, my success is my family's success. My failures are my family's failures. My family successes are my successes. My family failures are my failures. And there is this relationship that everything is interconnected, that we all have a place within the family systems, a place within, and everybody has an equal weight of their importance. Maybe not the same jobs or the same positions, but everyone is seen as equals. And this is when we look at, for example, the Tohono Nation, they when you look at their traditional ways of meeting, so when they went into the villages and had a discussion about something, they had to come to something called consensus. Consensus is that 100% of the people who are in that conversation should be in agreement. Okay, this is a very collectivistic idea that if someone in the room is still saying, no, I don't agree, then the conversation continues until the group comes to consensus. This is much different than the Western idea, where my ideas are important. Your ideas are important. So we do it by majority. We do it by the democratic process, as you would say. And so the majority wins in an individualistic culture. Consensus wins more in a collectivistic culture. And so those are really major differences. But as I mentioned, it gets more complicated than just saying, okay, the United States is an individualistic nation. Because while if you measure the broader cultures, yes, the United States does measure in individualism. It leans more towards the individualism side. But when you look at individual communities, we see that we can measure more collective in some and more individualistic in others. And a good example of this is an article was published, I think it was December or early January, where it showed the breakdown of more collective or individualistic states here in the United States. And they found that the newer the state, the later that state entered into the United States, became a state in the United States, the more individualistic they were. So one of the last states to come into the nation was Utah. And when we measure Utah, they're off the scale as far as individualism is concerned. But when we look at the older states, like the original 13 colonies, the New England area, they measure off the scale on collectivism. And it's this idea that, the individualistic idea of being here and that statehood creates this fortified person that is here to make their wealth, make their place, versus this idea more of collectively that we have a purpose together. So that's kind of the complicated part about this. And we can say the same thing when we look at research that comes out of India, China, Japan, Thailand, where they do overall measure very collective, but then they have pockets and communities that also measure very high in individualism. So it's much more complicated than just saying Eastern cultures are collective, Western cultures are individualistic. Now, why should we be taking this class? And I'll just emphasize these 2 points right now. And it really comes down to the term globalization. Okay. We have changing technologies and we have changing population demographics that are accelerating the change in cultures. Okay. Normally, when we look at a culture, cultures are meant to change. So one of the biggest differences between ethnicity and culture is your ethnic background does not change, but your culture evolves with the time. Okay. So an example is our changing technology. So here in the United States, before the advent of the internet and dating sites and Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, your life space was about 6 blocks from your house, meaning that the majority of people that got married lived within 6 blocks of each other. People who worked together tended to work within 6 blocks of each other. But then with the advent of the internet social media, you literally can date anyone across the globe. You could be dating someone in France, for example, right now, because of the changes in technology. We also have to recognize the changing population demographics. Okay, so just as an example here in the United States, and we'll be looking at this quite a bit in here when we do a cultural study of the United States, is white people by about 2029 will be the minority population in the United States. The majority population will be immigrants, Mexican Americans, and African Americans will be now becoming the majority demographic here in the United States. And we're actually already kind of seeing this in pockets across the United States where it mainly had been dominated by white European individuals, but now that demographic has shifted on a local or a state level. So we have to look at what do these changing population demographics mean? And as you can see right now, it's creating a lot of cultural upheaval. So you see this both this extreme right coming over. I think it's the MAGA group who are, we got to keep this country white. We've got to keep this country the way it was. We got to make sure that the deep state doesn't come in and make all these changes that we're seeing in our world happen. But then we also have to recognize that there's an extreme left that sometimes when you talk to someone and you're not sure if you should say his, he, them, it, by non-binary, I mean, that really extreme level. And if you simply say just the simplest wrong PC thing, you're criticized and you're seen as an awful person. So there's an extreme left and an extreme right. And what we're finding because of these demographic changes is that we have a U-shaped population democratic graphic between liberal and conservative mindsets. Instead of it used to traditionally be just one kind of bell curve where the majority of the Americans were moderate in their mindset, but we're seeing it becoming more and more extreme. So we'll look at these kinds of things as we move along through the class. All right. I'm going to skip this one for just a moment. I want to get to I want to kind of bring out some of the different a couple studies. One was Rebecca's new study on Italian children play. And this explores the connection between culture, play, and development. Okay. And it's something that has been named the developmental niche. Okay. And we found that physical and social settings of daily life, child rearing customs and practices, and psychology of caregivers, including parental beliefs about child rearing, really influence children's play, okay, and the idea of play. But as we've discussed, I think I brought it up in the developmental section, we see that, and if I didn't, I apologize. Classes are blending together. But the notion of play between the age of 3 and 6 very specifically determine a lot of child outcomes. But we find that culture plays a huge role on that as well, and what people's attitudes and beliefs are about child play. Okay. And we see that specifically, here, let me, okay. And so that's just an example again, and we find that in the reason I brought up the Italy study is we found that it is encouraged for children to be outside, being engaged. Play is an important part of their cultural practices. And even within work settings, so things like chores and all of those things have a play element to them. And we find that that creates a very close niche communities We see that things like depression rates and anxiety rates among Italians is much lower than ours and those kinds of things. So just kind of a more of a cross-cultural view. All right. So what is culture? And we're going to just kind of end with this today, so I can answer any questions. What is culture? Well, one, we start with customs. Okay, so the most easiest custom here to identify here in the United States is we don't eat based on our biological needs. We don't eat based on whether we're hungry or not. We eat based on the time of day it is. So breakfast you eat in the morning, lunch you eat around noon, 1 o'clock, and then dinner you. And so our custom for eating is based upon the time, not actual physiological processes. And then when we talk about practices, we're talking about expectations of, for example, work and school, um, driving, the way we drive, all of those practices that kind of make day-to-day life happen. And then we also look at routines. Okay. Probably the best example of routines is a little bit of a cultural differences is if you come from the north, when it comes to planning, they are actually a little bit better planners than we are here in the south. They tend to take a lot more time to make sure that the directions are clear, that things need to happen in a certain way. And then here in the south, we just kind of do things, right? But what are the routines that are different than here in southern Arizona? Well, here in southern Arizona, if we want to jump and go to the grocery store, we slip on our shorts and our sandals and we jump in the car and we go. But up in the north, especially during the winter time, if it's snowing and all of those things there, you have to think about the weather. Okay, so you got to make sure that your kids are properly dressed, that the coats and mittens and all of those kinds of things. You got to make sure that the car is running very, very efficiently. A lot of times you have to go clear the snow off the driveway before you leave. And so there's a lot of planning to do just to go to the grocery store. So those routines then create different kind of cultural things, such as planning for things and those kinds of things. Okay. And then we have what are called scripts. Okay. And scripts are ideas of how something should go. Okay. All right. So I'll give a good kind of cross-cultural example. Christmas. When I came here, and I've noticed this a lot with my wife and her family, when Christmas comes, you open gifts on the 24th. But where I come from, you open gifts on the 25th or the morning of the 25th. Because and again, it's just the two different scripts that coming from where I come from and in the cultural influence that I come from, that there it's about the morning of is when Jesus received gifts, so it's the time that you receive gifts. Where when you come here, there's more of an influence on the idea of the eve of the birth of Jesus and those kinds of things. So that's kind of just kind of a basic example of scripts and how they play and influence our ideas. And I think me and my family have come to a good settlement because yeah, we do it on the 24th now. So anyways, so that's just an example of those things. So what I want to do is I want to stop because I know I'm